Ford Motor has just announced that it's going to be conducting another round of layoffs, a sizable layoff in the near future of U.S. salaried workers, as it attempts to reach a cost savings goal of $3 billion by the middle of the decade. And so, it comes after or in an environment of lots of layoffs, right? Recently, in the last, call it 18 months, 24 months, we've seen companies that are well known, companies that are not so well known, companies in different industries conducting big layoffs, right? You can think of the tens of thousands at Facebook and different companies like that. And I thought it would be interesting to explore kind of how companies reach the decision of who to lay off during a reduction in force. And how, companies, regardless of who they end up laying off, can still protect their brand, right? And I come at this from an angle of employer brand, protecting your employer brand, so that, yes, if in the immediate future you've got to run a reduction in force or a mass layoff, that in 12 months or in 18 months, when these companies have to start hiring again, or the macroeconomic conditions change, hopefully more favorably, that they still have a brand to where people don't remember that they treated their employees terribly during the layoffs. I'm never going to go work there. Right? And there are tactics that companies can employ, HR departments can employ, to make sure that that doesn't happen. The reality is that layoffs, they suck, right? And they suck for everybody involved. I'll take that back. 99% of the people involved in layoffs probably hate it. There's probably a small minority of individuals who are looking for that exit and are going to use either a severance agreement or some money that they're given to maybe start their own business, do things that they probably wanted to do and just needed the excuse to leave. But for the majority of people, layoffs are just terrible. And, the economic stress that they put on a household, the emotional stress they put on the household and the individual, it's just something that if you can avoid it, of course, everybody wants to avoid it. But again, there are tactics that can be put in place. And I'll explore some of those a little later. But how do companies come up with the list of individuals that have to get laid off? Right? And there are a few factors that go into it. And some of these are intuitive and some of them, hopefully enlightening. But of course, the first, so I'll walk it back to kind of the initial. So when a company has to do a layoff, typically executives or managers are asked to, for the most part, come up with a list. All right, here's your department. We need to reach X in cost savings, for example. Who are we keeping and who are we going to let go? Right, and the managers and the executives have to go through and say, okay, they run whatever calculus they do. And the calculus typically involves one, job performance, first and foremost, right? Who is the weakest on our team? And they're typically the ones that are going to be at most risk to be laid off, right? So what was their last performance review, annual performance review like? How have they been in the recent quarter, 2 quarters? How have they bought into the different things that we're doing as a company, right? Are they attending one-on-one meetings? Are they doing different things? Right, and that's factor number one. Factor number two typically is tenure. Tenure is, there's some technical aspects to this. If you look at kind of a chart of U.S. workers' typical productivity over a course of a career and earnings, right? There's you can probably find that chart somewhere out on Google. Early in your career, typically individuals overproduce relative to their salary or relative to their compensation. It kind of equals out in the middle of your career, and then as you kind of get to the tail end of your career, your compensation typically outperforms your productivity. So that curve becomes higher than the curve for your productivity. And so, of course, in theory, then what you do is you look at tenure and you say, okay, if people who have been here the longest time typically compensated at the highest level relative to productivity, they're probably at risk to get laid off if the layoff is a cost-cutting measure. So that's one aspect of it. There's another aspect of it is when your tenure is too short. So last in, first out, LIFO. This is something that we saw a lot, I think, as a function of the Great Resignation. During the early days of COVID, companies that were doing mass hiring, think Peloton, think that the large tech companies, were bringing on tons and tons of new workers to 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 meet upticks in demand that were, pandemic driven. And these companies, as a function of whatever, rate hikes or a downturn in the economy, have had to lay off a bunch of people. And one of the tactics that they'll use is last in, first out. So the people who've been there the shortest amount of time are at most risk to be laid off. And that's kind of a different reason than the comp relative to productivity that we talked about a minute ago. Last in, first out is where if you've been here not a long time, that you probably haven't reached a level of mastery of your function. And, the people who have been here, call it 2, 3, 4, 5 years, have probably reached a level of mastery of their function. And so they're probably more valuable to keep around. So you've got the two ends of the spectrum there when it comes to tenure. The third is just skills. When employers have to do a round of layoffs, they may assess just the different skill sets and qualifications that employees have. And are those skills in demand? Are they specialized? Are these priorities that need to be retained? Are they easily found on the market? Can they be outsourced? Those are different things that factor into the calculus to go into who gets on the unfortunate list of being laid off. When companies do restructuring, this is item number 4, they're going to look at each line of their financial statements, and they're going to say, okay, well, do we need this department? Do we need this function for our business to continue to survive? This is why we often see marketing being one of the kind of primary places where, or one of the primary functions that get affected when layoffs happen. And that's because it's primarily an expense for an organization to be doing things like social media marketing, things like that unless you're doing it at real scale, don't often see a terribly high ROI. Departments or functions that are cost centers typically get looked at more carefully during reductions in force or layoffs. That would be the fourth one. And that kind of ties into just cost reduction in general. Like when, in the example of Ford, when they're trying to reach a number in cost savings by a certain timeline, $3 billion by 2025, you're just going to go look at what's the most expensive and say, okay, well, that's probably where we need to go. And all of this kind of gets folded in to the calculus of who gets laid off. And then what happens then is that HR then goes through the list and says, okay, have we introduced some level of bias into this? Are we laying off too many people who have been around too long, too many people over the age of 50, too many people over the age of 40? And they're kind of going to go do the scrubbing of the list to make sure that, no particular group or no particular individuals are affected more than others. And that's how you kind of get to the list of who gets laid off. Now, that said, layoffs don't have to be, they're life-changing in the sense that nobody's really expecting them, and when they do happen, the individuals affected typically have to change something about the way that they're going about things. But if companies care about their employer brand, which my recommendation is that they do, of course, and you want to build something that's sustainable to where, yes, you've got a momentary blip, but call it 6 months, 12 months in the future, you're going to have to hire again, then it behooves the organization to invest in stuff that will help their reputation. And, one of our clients is an organization that works in the, call it, layoff support space. And we've seen them kind of hit massive growth over the last 24 months because companies are seeing the value investing in their employees even as they're exiting. Because what it does is it protects their brand, right? You're less at risk of anything legal happening if people are exiting and feel supported. They feel like, okay, the company cares about me and they're trying to help me land on my feet. And you're protecting yourself from the risk of, say, negative reviews online, which we know as employer branding specialists matter. it's a ridiculously high percentage of individuals that look at online reviews before they decide if they want to join or even apply to a job. So things like supporting your employees on the way out, and that can be severance payments, sure, but it can be even more comprehensive to where you're giving them resumes and coaching and different things to really get them on their feet. It's something that, at Daggerfin we preach all the time, to definitely think about looking at services like that when you're conducting a layoff, because it mitigates all the negative connotations to the stuff that we talked about that go into the list of people that get laid off. And so understanding, as HR professionals, that layoffs affect human beings, and human beings have the real life things that they deal with. I think can actually take a lot of the stress off, because you can say, okay, well, how can we just help the human being? And is there a cost benefit that we can do to where we can provide more support, because it allows us to build something sustainable, such that in the future we're still going to be able to hire, because we haven't been negatively affected by the layoff. And in fact, if we really do a good job of supporting people on the way out, that could be a benefit in the future to where people will say, okay, I'm willing to join that company because I've heard from people that I know that even when things don't go well, which economic cycles call for, right? We get a recession every 7 years or so. That even when things don't go well, which is inevitable, they're going to look after me. And I think that's something that the companies can really lean into to separate themselves from an employer branding perspective going forward.